They buried the last villager at dawn. The church doors were barred, the windows boarded. No one had entered Ravendale in years. And yet, on a windless night, the bell rang slow hollow, as if someone, or something, was calling thee. Dead to service. The fog moves slowly over Ravendale. Doesn't drift, it coils a pale, heavy breath that never lifts, even when the sun cuts through the valley. From a distance, the village looks half buried beneath it, roofs and chimneys rising like the tops of gravestones. Beyond those rooftops, high above the shrouded streets, a hill rises steep bare. A spine of black soil and jagged rocket was here. The villagers say, where everything began, the hill above the fog. For generations, Ravendale's families avoided it, not because of wolves or the sudden storms that broke across the ridge, but because the ground felt wrong. Even before the church was built, even before the first priest came to bless it, there were whispers that nothing good could grow there. Farmers said the earth itself was sour. Dig deep enough, and your spade struck something hard. Not stone, not clay, something that made the metal ring. They stopped digging after that still. The hill remained, and when Ravendale's parish council decided the village needed a new church, something larger, something proud enough to bring trade to the region, they chose the hill. They said it was a place to lift prayers, closer to heaven. But the people who had lived there all their lives knew better. The year was 1839. Ravendale was small, fewer than 200 people, most of them farmers, woodcutters, or mill workers. Their houses leaned against one another like crooked teeth, roofs sagging beneath constant rain. The only sounds in the streets were the crack of hooves on cobblestone and the occasional toll of the village chapel bell. A single, dull note, swallowed quickly by the fog. It was Father Martin, a young priest newly assigned to the parish, who first suggested the hill. He believed that a new church, one visible for miles around, could bring pilgrims. Pilgrims meant coin meant salvation, not only for their souls, but for their starving town. The council agreed. Some said they didn't really have a choice, because by then, Ravendale had already begun to change. Livestock were dying. It started with a few sheep. They were found scattered along the lower pastures, lying perfectly still. No wounds, no struggle. Their eyes open, their tongues dark. The miller's horse was next. It collapsed mid-stride on the bridge that led to the town square. Its body so heavy, it took 6 men to roll it into the river by midsummer. Nothing born on Ravendale's soil survived longer than a month. The villagers began whispering about a sickness, others about a curse. They spoke of the fog, how it seemed to cling heavier each year, how it carried the faint smell of iron when the wind shifted, and so the hill became their answer. If they could raise a church there, high enough, holy enough, perhaps it could drive whatever was poisoning their home back into the earth. At least, that's what they told themselves. Construction began in September. The first crews who went to break the soil said it was like digging into frozen flesh. Dirt came up in clumps, slick and black, refusing to scatter like ordinary earth. The deeper they dug, the colder the air grew, even as the sun burned overhead. One of the laborers, a man named Elric Dobbs, refused to go back after the first week. He told the foreman that his spade had struck something beneath the soil, something hollow, and that when he put his ear to the ground, he swore he could hear breathing. They laughed at him, paid him half his wages, and sent him home by October. The foundations of the church had been laid, but the trouble only worsened that night. The workers began to hear the wind, not rushing, not whistling, but whispering, threads of sound winding through the half-built walls. Some swore they could hear words, though no 2 men ever agreed on what was said. Tools vanished from their places, shovels, picks. Even a heavy iron bell meant for the tower was found lying, half buried 50 yards from where it had been chained one evening. After the last light faded, a stonemason named Halle went missing. His boots were found neatly placed beside the trench where the bell tower would stand. His lantern, still burning, sat beside them. Hale was never seen again. Still, Father Martin pushed the men forward. He told them the unease they felt was proof that their work was necessary, that the land was resisting consecration, and that it would take faith, not fear. To tame it, the men obeyed. Most of them didn't believe in curses. They believed in wages. And by December, the skeleton of the church was complete. Its frame jutted against the fog like the bones of a shipwreck, the unfinished bell tower rising higher than any structure for miles. But by then, something had changed in Ravandalith. Livestock deaths had stopped the fog. Though still heavy, no longer smelled of iron, and the villagers, for the first time in months, began to sleep through the night without waking to strange noises at their windows. For a while, it seemed as though the hill was working, but something wasn't right in January, when the first heavy snows fell. The ground around the church began to sink, not evenly, not like a landslide. The soil closest to the bell tower seemed to sag inward, as though the earth beneath were hollowing out. The men tried to pack it. They filled the sinking ground with stone, with rubble, even with timbers, but nothing held by morning. Every attempt had been swallowed one night. The foreman, irritated by the delays, stayed on site past midnight to keep watch. He said he wanted to catch the men he suspected of sabotaging the work. What he heard instead was the bell of a bell that hadn't yet been hung. It rang once, a low, mournful tone that echoed through the snow-laden air. The foreman swore he saw the ground around the tower ripple when it struck. He left Ravendale the next morning. He didn't take his wages by February. Father Martin could no longer find workers willing to climb the hill. They said the fog up there tasted metallic again. They said the snow melted too quickly, sinking into the earth like water into ash. But the council, desperate, broke, and bound by the money already spent, hired replacements, men from other villages, men who didn't know the stories. And so, the bell tower continued to rise stone by stone. It reached higher, its skeletal form vanishing into the mist like a finger pointing at a gray. Indifferent sky villagers kept their distance. Even those who once championed the church now crossed the street when they passed the path leading up to the hill, because at night, the bell rang again. No one ever saw it move. No one ever found the clapper struck, but always, at the same hour, a single note rolled down into the fog, so deep it seemed to tremble the windows of their homes. And each time it rang, the dogs in the Asylum village began to howl. It was then that the older residents, those who remembered the stories their grandparents told, began to speak again of the curse. They said the hill had always been a place of burial, not for bodies, but for something older, something no one in Ravendale could name. One woman, the widow Ashcombe, told Father Martin that her grandfather once swore he'd seen the ground move there. Not like a quake, not like wind. She said he believed something beneath the soil shifted when people lingered too long. Father Martin dismissed her. He told her the church was for her protection, that once the first mass was held, no fog, no superstition, no old wives' tales could harm them. But the widow only stared at him. She didn't return to her home that night. The next morning, she was found at the foot of the hill. Her body was twisted, as though every bone had given way. There were no footprints leading to where she lay, not even her own. The council tried to keep it quiet. They told the villagers it had been an accident, that she'd likely fallen in the dark, but no one believed them. Not when the path to the hill was flat, straight, and clear of ice, and when the bell rang that night, louder than ever before. Some said they could hear something beneath it, not words, not a voice, a rhythm like a second sound, pulsing beneath the note, as though the hill itself were answering in march. Construction slowed again and vanished. Not many, but enough that the crews began to keep count. They stopped going up alone. They stopped staying after dusk. By now, the church was nearly finished. Only the upper chamber of the bell tower remained incomplete. The chamber that would hold the very bell that had begun to toll on its own. Father Martin wrote to the diocese, asking for a blessing to be performed. Before the tower was sealed, he said he feared the land was still resisting, that its unrest could threaten the consecration. The letter was sent. No one ever came. And so, the workers placed the final stones themselves. The tower reached its full height. cutting through the fog like a spear on the last day of construction as the final scaffolding was taken down. The men gathered in the nave to rest. The air was still then. Without warning, the bell rang 3 times low, slow, each note rolling out over the valley like a distant warning. The men dropped their tools. Some fled. Those who stayed swore they felt the floor tremble beneath their feet, and as the last note faded, a new sound took its place, a hollow, drawn-out exhale, not from the tower, not from the fog, from the ground beneath them. No, one spoke not at first, but when they left the church that night, not one of them returned the next day, and from that night onward, the bell never stopped. It rang faintly every evening at the same hour, even though no one had ever hung it, even though the tower's doors were sealed, and in the village below, the fog thickened so dense that people swore they could no longer see their own homes from across the street, and the dogs never stopped howling. The workshop stands alone at the edge of the river. Its roof sags beneath years of rain. Its windows are black, their panes slick with condensation, as though the building itself is sweating. The water below runs slow, dark, heavy with silt. It carries no sound except the dull lap of current against the stone embankment, and yet, from inside the workshop, something faint can be heard. The strike of hammer on metal, steady, reluctant, each blow landing like a heartbeat. For nearly 10 years, no one in Ravendale had heard that sound. The bell maker's name was Silas Drew, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, hair the color of ash, hands marked with deep, blackened scars from years at the forge. He had not taken a commission in almost a decade, not since the bell he cast for a small riverside parish down the coast, a bell that was never hung. The villagers there had buried it, sealed in a pit of lime, after claiming it had disturbed something in the water. They never spoke of what exactly had surfaced, only that 3 bodies, people they recognized, had been seen drifting near the river's bend, but they had been buried months before. After that, Silas swore he would never cast again. He shuttered his forge. He lived alone, and he avoided the river at all costs, except to fetch the buckets of silted water he used to cool his tools. When Ravendale's council approached him, he refused outright. They offered gold, board, even a contract exempting him from tithes for life. He shook his head, told them his work was done, and then they told him where the bell would hang, the hill above the fog. The council spoke of its purpose, of how it would sanctify the land, how its toll would carry beyond the valley, a sound so pure it might sweep the lingering sickness from the soil. Silas stared at them. He said nothing, but the next morning, his forge was lit for the first time in years. No one in Ravendale knew what changed his mind. Some claimed he had been threatened. Others said he had debts. A few whispered that he didn't want to do it, but something on that hill wanted him to. Whatever the reason, by the week's end, the sound of his hammer echoed over the river. The bell he cast was unlike any other in the region, taller, thicker, its body a dark, almost oily bronze that seemed to drink the light from the forge rather than reflect it. The clapper was heavier than a man could carry alone. Carved with deep, deliberate grooves, Silas never let anyone near it while he worked, not even his apprentice. A boy of 17 named Rowan Pike was permitted to step beyond the threshold. Rowan said Silas worked through the night, whispering under his breath as he shaped the molten metal, as though reciting a prayer or an oath. And Rowan noticed something else. The closer the bell came to completion, the quieter the river grew by the final night. He swore he could not hear the water at all. The day the bell was finished, Silas did not emerge from his workshop. Rowan returned at dawn to find the forge cold, the great bronze bell resting on its cradle. Silas was gone, his bed untouched. The only sign he had been there at all was a note pinned to the wooden frame of the bell's yoke. It was written in a shaking hand, the ink blotched as though it had been smudged by damp fingers. It read, "It will not ring for the living." The council had little choice. They hired 6 men to drag the bell by cart up the winding path to the hill. The work took 2 days. The wheel ruts gouged deep scars into the frozen road, marks that remained long after the snow thawed in spring at the top. The unfinished tower waited. The workers refused to carry the bell up the scaffolding. They left it at the base, chained to the foundation, muttering prayers under their breath as they descended back into the foreground, too frightened to remain. Alone with it, followed no one stayed on the hill that night. At midnight, the bell rang only once. The sound rolled down through the fog, carrying all the way to the River Rowan. Lying awake in his cot near the forge, swore the note was so deep it made the walls shudder. He pressed his hands over his ears, but still felt the vibration in his chest, as though the sound was not passing through the air, but rising from beneath the ground. The river outside, still and black, began to ripple the next morning. Silas's body was found. He lay face down at the water's edge. His fingers sunk deep into the wet silt as though he had tried to claw his way into the riverbed itself. His face was pale, lips parted, his expression locked somewhere between shock and a faint, twisted smile. There were no marks of violence, no water in his lungs, but the soles of his feet were burned, the skin blackened, cracked, as though he had been standing barefoot on the iron grate of his forge. No fire had been lit that night. The council buried him quickly. They told the village it had been a heart attack. They told Rowan to collect his master's tools and leave town, but by then, no one cared about Silas Drew. They cared only about the bell, because since it arrived on the hill, the dogs would not stop barking. The fog, once silent, now carried a faint hum at night, a vibration low and constant that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And though the bell had only rung once, people began to swear they could hear something else. Not a note, not a toll, but a faint, rhythmic throb like a pulse 2 nights after Silas was buried. Rowan returned to the forge. He said he couldn't sleep, that the sound was worse in his room, that the walls seemed to tremble every time the wind shifted. He stood at the edge of the river, listening to the slow lap of the current. That's when he heard Ida's single, heavy breath rising from the water, not the splash of a fish, not the groan of shifting ice. A breath, drawn and held, released. Rowan stumbled back. He ran through the fog until his lungs burned. By the time he reached the forge, the sound had stopped. River lay still, but in the dark workshop, resting on the cradle where Silas had left it, the bell was wet. Beads of river water traced its surface, and when Rowan touched it, the bronze was warm. The next morning, Rowan left Ravendale. He didn't pack his things. He didn't speak to the council. He told the miller's son, the only person he trusted, that the bell was wrong, that it had never been meant for the living. The boy asked him what he meant. Rowan stared at him and said only one thing. Silas didn't make it to be wrong. He never returned that night. The bell rang again, twice. No one on the hill, no one in the tower, but the sound carried down into the fog, rolling along the frozen streets and all the way to the river where the water began to rise. The fog was heavy that morning, so thick it seemed to hang from the eaves of every house, wrapping the narrow streets in a pale, unmoving shroud. The villagers of Ravendale moved through it slowly, lanterns in hand, their boots cracking against the frost-stiffened earth as they climbed the winding path to the hill. For weeks, the new church had stood silent above them, its bell tower rising into the mist like a finger pressed against the sky. Now, for the first time, its doors were open. The first mass would be held. Inside, the air was cold. The nave stretched wide, its unfinished walls still smelling faintly of lime, and damp stone light seeped through high, narrow windows, pale and flat, filtered by the fog outside. There was no fire in the hearth, only the faint echo of footsteps as the congregation shuffled into place. Father Martin stood at the altar. His vestments were simple, but his posture was firm. His voice, when he began to speak, carried cleanly through the space, as though the building itself were amplifying each word. The prayers rose into the stillness, soft, measured, a rhythm as familiar as breathing. For a while, it felt almost ordinary, but something wasn't right as the congregation lowered their heads. In silence, a sound drifted through the church, a single tone, low, hollow. It swelled slowly, as if rising not from the air above, but but from somewhere deep beneath the floor. The bell, yet no one had pulled the rope. Sound was unlike anything they had expected, not bright, not solemn, not the ringing call of worship that Father Martin had promised it. Was deep, resonant, the kind of tone that seemed to crawl into the bones. That settled in the stomach and lingered long after it faded. Some said they felt the floor tremble beneath their feet. Others swore the walls seemed to lean inward, just slightly, as the sound reverberated through the nave, and when it stopped, the silence it left behind felt heavier than before. Father Martin did not acknowledge Ive, finished the Mass. His voice never wavered, though his hands trembled as he folded the altar cloth. The congregation left quietly. Not one person spoke of the bell as they descended the hill that night. The animals changed it, began with the sheep in the lower pasture, normally docile. They pressed themselves against the fence, kicking and ramming the wooden posts until two splintered apart. When the farmer approached, lantern in hand, the flock turned on him. Dozens of small, wild eyes catching the light, unblinking. Before they lunged forward in a chaotic burst of movement, he ran the next morning. His fields were empty. Every sheep had vanished. The only trace left behind was a single, deep furrow in the soil, as though something massive had dragged itself across the earth toward the direction of the church. By the second night, it spread. Cows broke from their pens, charging through the streets at odd hours. Bellowing in the dark, dogs snapped at their owners, howling in unison when the fog rolled down from the hill. Even the birds seemed to vanish, their calls replaced by a stillness so complete it felt unnatural. But the worst came in sleep. The villagers began to dream. Dreams always began the same way: darkness, cold, the faint sound of water rushing somewhere close, but unseen. Then voices, dozens. At first, then hundreds, muffled, distorted, as though speaking through a wall of liquid. Men, women, children, their words impossible to make out, yet their panic unmistakable. And beneath those voices, another sound, a slow, steady toll each time it struck. The dreamers felt the floor give beneath their feet, felt the cold weight of water rising around their legs, chest, throat. They woke gasping, clawing at their blankets, as though breaking the surface of a dark river. Some swore they still heard the voices after waking, a faint echo from beneath the floorboards of their homes. Others claimed they could still taste the water in their mouths. Father Martin dismissed the fears as hysteria. He told them the bell was a blessing, that the dreams were nothing more than the mind struggling against the changes a holy place brings. But even he began to avoid the hill after dusk. Told the sexton, a man named Joseph Harrow, to lock the tower door each evening and to check the rope to make certain no one had tampered with it. Harrow obeyed. On the third night, just as he was fastening the final lock, he heard it, the bell, not from the tower, not from above. From beneath him the tone rolled up through the frozen ground, so deep it rattled the hinges of the heavy oak door. Harrow froze. His lantern shook in his hand, the flame shivering as the air seemed to grow colder. And then, in the Azozia stillness between echoes, he heard another sound, not a toll, not a voice, a breath, drawn and slow, deliberate. He backed away from the door, didn't bother to finish the lock. By the time he reached the village, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the key. That night, the bell rang again 3 times, each note rolling down into the fog, so low it seemed to vibrate in the walls of every house. And as the villagers lay awake, listening, they felt it again, the faint, rising sound of voices. From the ground beneath the church, from beneath their own floors, the voices were louder now, clearer. They weren't speaking words, they were screaming when morning came. The streets of Ravendale were empty, doors shut, curtains drawn tight. No one spoke above a whisper, as though any noise might draw something closer. Even Father Martin had grown pale. His sermons were shorter. His eyes darted often to the tower windows, as though expecting to see something peering down through the fog. And when the next Sunday came, fewer than half, the village climbed the hill. They told themselves they wouldn't listen for the bell, that they wouldn't hear it, not if they focused on their prayers. But when the silence came, It rang again only once deeper than before, and for the first time, the villagers heard something new, not from the tower, not from the ground, from within the note itself a faint, wavering chorus, dozens of voices, carried inside the tone, as though the sound itself were breathing that night. The dreams returned this time. No one woke dry. Every dreamer bolted upright to find their beds soaked beneath them, not with sweat, with water-cold, stagnant carrying. The faint smell of silt and rust. Some swore it tasted like the river. Others said it tasted like blood. By dawn, 2 families had packed their carts and fled Ravendowlaeth. Others stayed, not out of courage, but because they could not bring themselves to step beyond the fog. Something in it felt heavy, watching, waiting in. As the first light broke through the valley, the bell rang again. No one had touched the rope. No one had entered the tower, but the sound rolled down the hill, deeper than ever before, until the frost on the windows began to crack. And in the pasture, beyond the last row of homes, the ground began to shift. Something moved beneath the soil, and the sheep, the few that remained, turned their heads toward the church. Every one of them at the same time. The fog around Ravendale did not move that night. It hung in the air like gauze, wrapped tight over the streets, so dense that even the lanterns burning along the church path cast no glow. From the base of the hill, the new bell tower rose like a shadow, a dark, silent silhouette against the gray, its upper windows faintly lit by the pale reflection of the moon. It looked still empty, but it wasn't. Brother Aldwin had come to Ravendale as a messenger, a friar from the monastery of St. Barashil. He had been sent to deliver correspondence to Father Martin, a warning, though he would not learn its full contents until long after his visit. By the time he arrived, most of the village had withdrawn into their homes, curtains drawn, doors barred against the fog that had grown thicker by the day. Aldwin found the church easily enough. Its heavy wooden doors stood shut, the path deserted, the tower looming high above. Silent as a crypt, he had not planned to stay, but the fog rolled in behind him so quickly, swallowing the road back to the inn, that he decided to shelter inside until morning. It was then, standing at the base of the tower, that he noticed the light, a faint, flickering glow. It bled through the slats of the shutters in the belfry high. Above, the sort of light a lantern might give, but warmer, softer, moving in uneven waves, as though carried by unseen hands. At first, Aldwin assumed workers had remained behind. Perhaps the bell, which had been ringing on its own for weeks, was finally being inspected. But as he waited at the heavy oak doors, listening, he heard nothing. Not voices, not footsteps, not the scrape of tools against stone. Only a low hum in the air, a vibration, too faint to name, that seemed to gather around the base of the tower like a living thing. And that's when he saw them, figures faint, motionless, standing behind the glass of the belfry windows. Their shapes were blurred by distance and fog, but their stillness was unmistakable. A small group, heads bowed, shoulders drawn in, as though listening. They did not move as Aldwin approached. They did not turn toward him, though the snow beneath his boots crunched loud enough to echo. When he called up to them, his voice was swallowed by the fog before it reached the tower, and still they did not stir. Aldwin felt a chill run through him, not from the air, which was already bitterly cold, but from the strange uniformity of their posture. Their faces, even at that distance, seemed angled inward, not down, not toward the floor, but toward something higher within the belfry, as if all of them were watching, or listening, to something just above their heads. He told himself it was a simple gathering, workers, perhaps even Father Martin himself, conducting some late-night vigil. But then the light changed. It dimmed not as a lantern might when its fuel runs low, but in sharp, deliberate intervals, flickering from bright to nearly dark, bright to dark, in a slow, pulsing rhythm with each dimming. The figures seemed to lean closer toward whatever hung above them, their shapes elongated in the shifting light, their heads canting at unnatural angles as they craned upward. And then the bell rang only once, but the tone was so deep, so resonant, that Aldwin felt it in his ribs before he heard it in his ears. The snow beneath his boots vibrated, the frozen wood of the tower groaned. A low creak that carried into the fog like a whisper above. The figures did not flinch. They did not startle or move instead. As the echo faded, Aldwin saw their heads tilt even farther back, their faces vanishing completely into shadow as they lifted their chins toward the unseen source of the sound. And though he could not hear voices, he felt something, a pressure, a subtle weight in the air, as though a sound too low to register was pressing against the inside of his skull. He stumbled back from the base of the tower, his breath rising in short, frantic bursts. The fog shifted then, curling low to the ground in slow, deliberate waves. It rolled past his boots over the stone path, climbing the hill toward the village, as if drawn by some invisible pull. Aldwin tried to call out, to announce himself, to demand an answer from whoever was inside the belfry, but his voice broke. The air around him was too heavy, too dense, each word swallowed before it could leave his throat. And from above, the light went out for a moment. There was nothing, no glow, no figures, only the dark, skeletal silhouette of the tower rising into the fog. Then, in the silence, Aldwin heard something new, not the bell, not the hum, a faint, collective sound breathing slow, steady, dozens of inhalations and exhalations, perfectly synchronized, drifting down through the cold night air. And then, between one breath and the next, the sound stopped. Aldwin turned to flee. The path down the hill was gone, swallowed completely by fog, so thick it reflected his own lantern light back at him in a dull, blinding glow. Every direction looked the same, a pale, shifting wall that closed in as he spun, searching for a way out. He tried to run, his boots slipping on the frost-hardened ground, but as he reached the first bend in the path, the bell rang again twice. This time, the tone rolled through the fog like a physical wave, rattling the branches of the bare trees and making the frozen ground tremble beneath his feet. And in that deep, vibrating hum, he heard a sound beneath the toll-knot voices, not whispers, a low, gurgling rush like water pouring upward, not down. When he finally reached the inn, breathless and pale, Aldwin could barely speak. The villagers who listened to his account later swore. He repeated one phrase over and over, his voice barely above a whisper. They weren't praying. When asked what he meant, he stared down at his shaking hands and said nothing. But before dawn, he packed his satchel and left Revendale on foot. The innkeeper watched him go, his figure vanishing into the dense, colorless fog that still clung to the streets. That morning, as the first pale light crept over the valley, the bell rang one final time, a single, drawn-out note, so low it set the glass in every window trembling. And in the silence that followed, the innkeeper swore he could hear something faint, drifting down from the tower through the fog. Not a voice, not a breath, a slow, deliberate knock from wood deep below the church floor. The fog that night felt heavier than ever before it pressed against the windows of every home, pale and wet, like breath on glass. The streets of Ravendale were silent. No wind, no animals. Not even the distant rush of the river could be heard beneath the blanket of mist that smothered the village. It was just past midnight when the first note struck. The bell rang 13 times. Each toll rolled through the fog in deep, rolling waves, as if the air itself was being forced apart with every strike. There was no wind, no keeper in the tower, and no hand on the rope. The sound did not echo. It lingered, as though the tone had weight, sinking into the walls and floorboards of every home with each toll. Something shifted in the village. The latches on doors began to rattle, then snap open one by one. Every door swung wide, creaking into the fog as if pulled by some unseen current. But there was no current. The air was perfectly still inside those homes. People woke to the sound of wood splitting, to cold drafts crawling down their hallways, to the distant, unbroken sound of the bell. Some tried to close their doors, forcing them shut against an invisible resistance that felt less like wind and more like something holding them open. Others didn't make it that far. They froze where they stood, their eyes caught by something far stranger. Every mirror in the village had changed tall, or small, cracked, or polished, mounted to the walls or resting on a table, each one showed the same thing: the bell tower, not the reflection of the room, not the faces of those standing before it, only the tower rising through fog, its upper windows glowing faintly, as if lit from within by something neither flame nor sun. Some turned their mirrors to face the wall. It didn't matter. Reflection remained. The tower hovered in the glass, unmoving, fixed in the same pale light. No matter which direction the mirror was turned, children screamed. One family, desperate, covered every reflective surface they could find: plates, metal basins, even the slick, frost-touched panes of their windows. But as they worked, a sound rose. Beneath the toll of the bell, a faint, distant murmur, voices not from outside, not from the air, from the mirrors themselves. The voices were not distinct, not words, not language, but a sound like dozens of mouths whispering just below the surface of the glass. Those who listened too long claimed they could feel something in their chest begin to sink without a rhythm, slow, steady throb, like a pulse. And then, on the ninth toll, the mirrors changed again. The tower was gone. The glass now showed only darkness. But in that darkness, faint shapes began to move, shadows fluid and indistinct, drifting as if suspended in water. They twisted and writhed, their outlines faint, their movements too slow to be fully seen. One villager, too frightened to look away, leaned closer to the folly mirror, and that's when he heard a breath drawing from somewhere deep within the glass. Cold, wet air rushed outward, fogging the surface of the mirror and filling the room with the smell of stagnant water. The villager stumbled back, clutching his throat, his chest tightening, as though the breath had been pulled from him instead. The mirror cleared. The tower had returned, but now the upper windows were dark by the 13th toll. The streets of Ravendale were empty. Not a soul dared to step beyond their thresholds, though the doors still gaped open, creaking softly on their hinges as the fog pressed through. Every opening in 4 homes, no lights burned at all by dawn. Those homes would be found empty, beds left unmade, fires burned low to ash, doors standing wide as if the families had walked out in the night and vanished into the mist. The only trace left behind in each was a single object placed neatly at the center of the flora mirror in the first house. The mirror faced the doorway. Its glass was dark, faintly rippling, as though a thin layer of water had formed over its surface. When the searchers tilted it, droplets slid down the glass, soaking into the floorboards. In the second, the mirror lay flat, its reflection filled not with the ceiling, but with a faint image of the bell itself, swinging slowly, though no one had touched it in days. In the third, the mirror was cracked. From the fractures, a faint hum emanated, almost too low to hear. Those who leaned close claimed the vibration ran up through their teeth and into their skulls, a sound that stayed with them for hours after leaving the room. And in the fourth, the mirror was gone entirely. Only a faint, wet outline remained on the wooden floor. The boards darkened as if something heavy and soaked had rested there for hours. Father Martin ordered the mirrors collected and locked away in the church cellar. He told the villagers it was a test of faith, that the bell's toll was a reminder, not a curse, that the disappearances were the work of fear itself, not some force stalking them from the fog. But even he would not climb the tower when asked why. His answer was quiet, uneven. "There's something up there," he said. "Not the bell, not people." When pressed, he shook his head, his eyes fixed on the hill beyond the fogged glass of the rectory window. And as he spoke, the bell rang again. Only once that single note carried farther than before, down through the streets, across the frozen fields, all the way to the river, where the ice that had crusted over its surface began to splinter, thin cracks spreading outward like veins from the center. Villagers stood still, listening, and beneath the note, they heard something faint, not voices, not whispers, a sound like wood bending slow, deliberate, from somewhere deep below the church floor. The fog never lifted that morning. By dusk, the searchers sent to find the missing families had not returned. There, lanterns left burning on the path were found toppled in the snow, their flames extinguished, their glass slick with condensation as though pulled from the bottom of a cold river. The only sound in the village, as night fell, was the faint hum that had begun to rise again, low and constant, from somewhere beneath the hill, and just after midnight. The bell began to swing on its own slow, heavy, each movement silent until, at the peak of its arc, a single deafening toll split the night air, and in every mirror that still remained, hidden or uncovered, the tower appeared again. But now, something stood at the highest window, not a person, not a shadow, something taller, and still, its face turned inward listening. The rectory was colder than the air outside its windows, fogged and rimmed with frost, let in no light. The candles, though lit, burned weakly, their flames trembling as though a draft moved constantly through the room. But there was no draft. The doors were sealed, the shutters bolted. Father Marin sat at his desk. His ink had begun to freeze in the well, congealing into a sluggish, dark pool, but still he wrote. The pages of his journal had grown uneven, not neat, not the measured hand he'd been known for, but slanted, urgent strokes, the words running together as though he feared the ink would stop flowing before he finished. And outside, through the fog, the bell tower waited. The entries begin. Simple Marin writes of the fog, of the way it hangs lower now, seeping into the streets even in daylight, pooling along the gutters and drifting into homes through the smallest cracks. He notes the birds first there. Absent by late winter, their calls had vanished entirely, leaving the skies and trees empty, no crows on the rooftops, no sparrows in the hedges. He writes that the silence settled him more than the bell itself. The world feels hollow. He notes like a place after a funeral, when the last mourner has left. But something wasn't right in a later entry. His tone changes. He describes the water, the taste not of iron or rot, but ash as though a fire had burned somewhere upstream, leaving only the faint, dry bitterness of soot behind. The villagers, he writes, refuse to drink it. They have begun to collect snow instead, melting it over their hearths, even as their wood piles dwindle. Marin notes that he can no longer taste the difference, that everything, water, wine, even bread, carries that same faint flavor now, lingering on his tongue, no matter what he eats or drinks. And at night, he says, it seems to rise into the air, leaving the rectory thick with the scent of something burned long ago. The next pages are shorter. The handwriting grows erratic. He writes of the sermons of a voice, soft and close, whispering his words just before he speaks them. He has searched the pews, stood in silence, listening for any sound beyond the creak of the beams or the shifting of the fog outside. But each time he resumes, the whisper resumes too, always a half breath ahead, as though the sermon is not his own, but something repeating itself through him. One evening, he writes of waking to find his breath visible in the rectory, not because of the cold, though it is always cold now, but because his breath does not rise. It sinks, each exhale falling toward the floor, as though drawn down by something beneath the wooden boards. The ink here is smeared, the lines trail off, restarted, then broken again, as though his hand shook while writing. He ends that entry with a single line, they are not beneath us, we are above them. By the second week, his words are shorter fragments. He writes of hearing the hum in his sleep, low and constant, a sound that vibrates in his teeth and bones. He says the fog outside moves differently, now not with the wind, but with purpose, as though it is listening. And then there is one entry where the ink has bled so deeply into the page, it nearly tore through. I heard it in my chest tonight, not the bell, not the voices, something waiting every time it swings. Something stirs, not calling us to prayer. The final entry is dated 3 days later. It is only one line. The ink is darker than the rest, thicker, as though the pen had been pressed into the paper with enough force to nearly break it. It is not calling us to prayer. It is calling us to feed. The journal was found by Joseph Harrow, the sexton, 2 days after Marin disappeared. The rectory was empty, the hearth cold, a bed untouched. The ink still pooled on the desk where his pen had fallen. Harrow noted that the door had been locked from the inside. The shutters too. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, only the faint sound of the bell swinging above, its chain creaking softly in the night air. Though no toll came, when Harrow brought the journal to the remaining villagers, most refused to read it. Those who did said the pages carried a faint, ashen smell, as though the paper had been held above a smoldering fire. One page, the final entry, seemed warm to the touch when held close. Some swore they could feel a faint vibration running through the paper, a pulse that quickened as the bell swayed in the tower above. And that night, the bell finally rang again, only once, but the note lasted longer than any before, rolling through the village in a single, unbroken tone that seemed to stretch for minutes, vibrating through the walls, into the floors, into the soil itself. Thickened, the houses groaned, and in the rectory, where Father Merrin had written his final words, the ink well tipped over, not from any hand, not from a draft. It simply slid from the desk, as though nudged by something unseen. Spilling dark, sluggish ink across the final page, the words vanished beneath the spreading black, and in the silence that followed, Harrow swore he could hear a faint sound rising through the floorboards. Beneath his feet, not the hum, not the toll chewing. The storm began just before dusk. The wind came first, howling low through the valley, driving the fog into frantic spirals that scraped along the rooftops. Then came the rain, not in sheets, but in thin, needling bursts that carried silt and grit, turning every street into a thin, black slurry. Graveyard sat on the hill, just beyond the church. The soil there was shallow, packed tight by frost and stone. But by midnight, the ground began to shift. The graves did not flood. They opened by morning. The rain had stopped. The fog had not. It lingered thick, clinging to the skeletal branches of the trees and curling low over the crooked headstones. The first to see it was Elias Braun, a farmer walking the ridge for a fallen fence post. At first, he thought the storm had washed the earth away, that the soil, saturated and loose, had simply collapsed. But as he moved closer, his boots sinking into the soft ground, he saw the truth. Every coffin was gone, not broken, not splintered. The lids had not been pried off. The boxes had not been dragged whole from their resting places. The graves themselves were hollow, dark, yawning cavities in the soil, each lined with deep parallel grooves that raked down the sides like claw marks. Each set of grooves led upward. Braun followed them, not far, only a few yards before the grooves joined into wider tracks. The churned earth climbing the slope toward the church. The paths were precise, direct, as though whatever had made them had. No need to wander, no hesitation about where it was going. At the base of the hill, where the grass turned to the first stretch of stone path, the tracks simply stopped. No prints, no drag marks, only clean, wet stone, slick with runoff from the rain. Braun stood there for a long time, staring at the church above, and that's when he heard it, the bell. It rang once, the sound rolled down the hill in a low, shuddering wave, setting the puddles along the path to trembling. Braun's chest tightened. The air felt heavier, as though the note was pulling it from his lungs. And then it rang again inside the village. People woke to the sound. Some counted the tolls, fearful it would climb to 13 again, as it had weeks before, but it stopped at 2 too deep. Drawn-out notes that left the windows humming long after the clapper. Fell still. Those who lived closest to the hill swore they felt the vibrations in their walls. Plates trembled in cupboards, nails creaked in their beams. One woman, clutching her child by the window, said she could see the fog outside pulse in rhythm with each toll like a lung breathing by daylight. Word had spread of the graveyard. Dozens of villagers gathered on the slope, boots sinking into the soft, black earth, staring down at the emptied holes. Some prayed, others cursed, a few began to dig, certain the storm had simply washed the coffins deeper into the hill. But there were no coffins to find. The grooves in the soil were clean, precise. The walls of each grave raked with the same long, deep furrows, as though something had gripped the earth itself and pulled its way upward. Not one of the disturbed plots showed a sign of wood or bone only. The empty holes and the grooves always leading toward the church. Father Merrin was gone by then. It was Joseph Harrow. The sexton who led the others to the steps of the tower. He tried to open the door. The hinges groaned, but held the iron latch. Though not locked, felt fused in place, as though the wood had swollen and sealed itself against the frame. Through the gap beneath the door, a faint draught drifted out, cold damp carrying with it a smell no one could name, not rot, not mold, something drier, like old soil, sifted through bare hands. The villagers left before dark. No one dared to stay near the church once the fog began to thicken. The graveyard, once a place of mourning, felt hollow, now empty, not just in the ground, but in the air itself. That night, the wind did not return. The fog hung still, and in the stillness, the bell swayed. No one saw it move. The windows of the belfry were dark. The shutters latched tight, but those awake in the village below swore they could hear the chain strain, the faint creak of its wooden frame, bending with each slow arc. It did not ring that night, not until the hour before dawn. Then, as the first gray light began to seep over the ridge, it tolled twice more, too deep. Drawn-out notes, the sound rolled down into the streets, through the houses, vibrating in the wooden beams and across the frozen fields, and for a moment, every puddle in Ravendale seemed to ripple inward, as though something beneath the water had stirred. At sunrise, Elias Braun returned to the graveyard. The fog was thinner now, clinging in wisps around the headstones. Every grave was still empty, but the grooves in the soil had deepened overnight, not new ones. The same tracks, as though whatever had clawed its way out had come back and gone beneath again. Braun told no one what he saw when the others arrived. He said only that the graves had been left as they were, that nothing new had changed. But that evening, alone in his home, he sat at his table long after the sun had set, staring at the dirt caked on his boots, and in the silence of his kitchen, he heard a faint, distant hum, not from the hill, not from the air, from beneath the floorboards. And just as he leaned closer, pressing his ear to the wood, the bell tolled once more, not twice, not 13, once, long enough for the sound to vibrate up through the ground, into his ribs, into his skull, and beneath that single drawn-out note, he heard another sound, not voices, not whispers, the faint, wet drag of something heavy being pulled through soil. The church stood like a shadow in the fog. Its walls, streaked with damp, glistened faintly in the pale moonlight, each stone blackened by weeks of wet and cold. The bell tower loomed above, the wooden frame groaning softly with each sway of the wind. Though the air around it was still inside, every candle had been lit. The nave was filled with survivors, the last in Ravendale, who had not yet fled or vanished. Families huddled in the pews, their faces pale, their breaths clouding in the cold air. Despite the heat of the flames, the doors had been barred from the inside, chains pulled taut across the heavy wood planks nailed into the stone frame until no gap remained. But something wasn't right. They had gathered at dusk under the direction of Joseph Harrow. It was his idea to hold a final mass, to pray, to demand deliverance, to end whatever had gripped Ravendale before another family vanished into the fog. Some believed it, some only came because they feared the alternative, to be alone when the bell rang again. They whispered as they waited. The fog outside clung to the windows, pale and unbroken, pressing faintly against the glass, as if drawn to the light. Every now and then, someone swore they heard a faint, low beneath the floor, but no one spoke of it. The candles burned low as the hours passed. Harrow led them in prayer. His voice trembled, breaking often, his words echoing strangely in the still air of the nave. There was no wind outside, no movement beyond the shifting of the flames, but the echoes lingered, faint and delayed, as though something in the rafters above was repeating him. A breath behind it grew colder as the night deepened. Some pulled blankets over their shoulders. Others leaned into the warmth of the candles, their eyes locked on the barred doors, waiting for the sound. They all dreaded the bell, but the bell did not ring, not yet. At some point, just before dawn, the church began to shake, not violently, just a slow, steady tremor that rattled the chains across the door and sent dust sifting down from the beams above. The bell tower swayed overhead, the groan of its frame rising through. The stone walls, like the sound of a living thing straining in its sleep harrow, climbed the pulpit, raising his voice to speak above the creaks and groans. But his words faltered. He froze mid-sentence, his mouth still open. As every eye in the church turned toward the belfry, the bell was swinging. Its massive shape could be seen through the small slit windows, swaying hard enough now that the wooden beams supporting it shuddered with each arc. The chain strained, the clapper swayed, but no sound came, not a whisper, not a toll. The silence was worse than any note they had heard before. Every person in the church froze, their breaths shallow, their bodies rigid as the bell swung harder, faster, the shadows of its motion sweeping across the fog-clouded glass. And then they heard it, not a toll, not a chime, a pressure, a sudden, crushing weight in the air, rolling down from the tower like a wave and sinking into every beam, every stone, every body inside. The candles guttered. Several went out entirely, the chains on. The doors snapped taut, vibrating as though something immense had pressed against the church itself. People began to choke, not on smoke, not on fog, on nothing. The air grew heavy, as though it were thickening in their throats, turning every breath to a shallow gasp. And still the bells swung soundless one by one. They began to scream, not from pain, from the sensation, a deep, suffocating pressure building behind their ears, inside their skulls, as though something enormous was pressing inward from all sides. Some clutched their heads, others collapsed between the pews, their hands clawing at their throats, their eyes rolling back as the silent weight grew stronger, pressing them down into the cold wooden floor. And through it all, the bell kept moving, its shadow flickering across the walls in the faint, dying light of the candles. But still, no sound. Harrow tried to lead another prayer, his voice cracking into a hoarse shout, but the words were lost before they left his mouth. Not silenced, swallowed. The sound of his voice seemed to vanish in the air, as though the weight itself devoured every syllable before it could reach another ear. He stumbled from the pulpit, falling to his knees, his eyes bloodshot, his lips moving though no sound escaped. The others writhed on the floor, their mouths open in silent screams, their faces pale, their eardrums straining as veins rose beneath their skin. And just as the first light of dawn broke through the fog, the bell stopped. The silence that followed was total. No creak of the frame, no rattle of the chains. The fog outside seemed to settle, its pale mass no longer pressing against the windows. The church stood still for 3 days. No one entered. The doors, still barred, stood cold and unmoving as the village around them emptied entirely. No animals, no voices, no sound but the faint creak of the tower above. Now still once more. When they finally broke inside, they found the pews filled. Every survivor sat slumped forward, their mouths agape, their bodies frozen in the positions they had fallen there. Eardrums had burst, each face was pale, the lips tinged blue, the throats marked by faint bruises where fingers had clawed for air. The candles had burned to stubs, their wax pooled and hardened across the floor like frozen tears. Not a single mark of struggle remained, only the faint, lingering smell of ash in the air, heavy and dry, clinging to the stone as though the walls themselves had burned. And in the belfry above, the bell swayed once more, just enough to creak the wooden beams. Still no sound, but that night, those who had dared to enter swore they heard something, not from the tower, not from the fog, from beneath the church floor, a sound like wood bending, and then a slow, wet drag, as though something enormous was still moving, waiting for the next mass. The sky above Ravendale was gray when they came for the church, not with storm clouds, not with fog, just a flat, lifeless light that washed every rooftop and tree in a colorless pallor, as though the world itself had gone still. The diocese arrived at dawn, 2 wagons of men, each carrying oil, torches, and a writ marked with a single order: erase at the survivors. Those who hadn't fled to the far villages stood behind their shuttered windows, watching in silence as the doors of the church were pried open and the last traces of wax and ash within were swept into the street by nightfall. Only the bell tower stood the wood dry, the frame groaning softly in the evening wind. But something wasn't right. They doused it with oil buckets thrown against the blackened stone, splashing down into the dead grass below. The smell of fuel cut through the stale air, acrid and sharp, masking the faint, lingering scent of soot that still clung to the stones. The men hesitated when they reached the belfry. Bell was still there, hanging motionless. Its dark brown surface glimmered faintly in the failing light, as though it had not weathered the same damp, soot-stained nights as the tower around it. The wood was brittle, the beams splintered at the edges, but the bell, it looked untouched. They tried to take it down. First 4 men climbed the beams, setting ropes around its lip and clapper, but the ropes frayed almost immediately, snapping as though cut from within. One man swore he saw sparks as the fibers broke, tiny flashes that vanished before the others could confirm. The foreman ordered it left in place. Tower would burn with the bell inside. The men descended, shaking fuel from their hands, wiping soot from their sleeves. No one looked at the bell again. When the torches were thrown, the fire spread fast. The dry wood caught instantly, the flames racing up the tower's frame with a sound like rushing wind. The night air grew bright, the glow casting long shadows across the empty streets as the few who remained in Ravendale watched from their windows. The flames roared, the tower cracked, but the bell did not fall. It hung, black against the rising inferno, its surface glimmering faintly as the beams beneath it gave way, one by one, and when the tower finally collapsed, it landed in the ash, unscathed at first. They buried it on the Hilla shallow pit, lined with stones, covered with layers of soil, until only a patch of disturbed earth remained where the church had stood. The diocese marked the ground with a simple post, warning all to keep clear. But within days, the warnings began. Men sent to guard the site swore they could hear it, not tolling, not swinging, just a faint huma, resonance that rose through the soil whenever someone in the village above took their final breath. A decision was made. The bell would be moved farther away, deeper, somewhere no sound could rise, no vibration could touch the village. They chose the quarry south of Ravendale, a wound in the earth where the stone was soft, where pits already reached deeper than any building in the village stood. The bell was hauled by oxen, lashed to a wagon so heavy it split the dirt roads into deep, grooved tracks that would remain for years. Men kept their distance. As it moved, some swore they could feel the vibrations through the reins, the handles of the wagon, even the ground itself. One refused to drive, claiming the hum had risen through his boots into his teeth. The quarry swallowed it, lowered by chains into the deepest pit. The bronze mass gleamed faintly in the dim light as it descended, vanishing into the shadows below. The workers poured soil over it, stone, debris, hundreds of pounds, until the pit was sealed. The last chains were cut, the ground packed flat, and for a time, the hum stopped. The village exhaled. Weeks passed. The fog began to lift. Birds returned to the hedges and trees, their calls faint, but steady in the mornings. The water, still bitter with ash, at least no longer smelled of smoke. But then, the first death. It was a miner, crushed beneath a slide of loose stone as he dug a new passage near the quarry's lower edge. His crew carried him up to the surface, laying his body on a plank while they called for help. And as they stood in silence, waiting, one man heard a faint, low tone, not a hum, not a toll, just a vibration, deep below, so subtle it could have been mistaken for wind moving through the cavern walls. But there was no wind. The air was still. The tone grew for only a moment, just long, enough for the men to feel it in their bones, a pressure in their ribs and teeth. Before fading back into silence, none of them spoke, but each, quietly, began to count how many more times they would hear it. It did not stop. Every death in Ravendale, no matter how far from the quarry, brought the sound, not loud, never loud, always faint, always deep, a vibration that rolled through the stone of the quarry, through the soil, through the boots of the men working the pits. Some began to refuse the shifts near the lowest tunnels. They swore They could hear it even when no one had died a slow, steady rhythm like breathing one night, weeks after the third burial. Near the village, a crewman reported seeing dust rising from the sealed pit knot, stirred by wind drawn upward, as though something below had exhaled. The others laughed, told him it was settling soil, a trick of the lamplight, nerves fraying from the long shifts and the hum. But when he returned the next day, he found the ground cracked a thin, jagged line running from the edge of the pit to the quarry floor. The diocese sent no one. The quarry was sealed, the roads to it blocked. No one in Ravendale speaks of the bell now, but sometimes, on cold nights when the fog drifts low and the fields freeze over, they say you can feel, do not hear it, feel at a pulse through the soil, a faint, slow rhythm that travels up through the roots, into the walls, into the beds of those still living above. And when the breath of the village goes still, the rhythm changes. One long, drawn-out note rising through the ground, like a voice held just beneath the earth, waiting for the next death. The hills around Ravendale are quiet now. The fields where the fog once hung are overgrown. The stone walls collapsed, the paths swallowed by moss and briar. The village itself is little more than scattered foundations, blackened stones and half-buried beams where homes once stood even. The birds avoid the air above it only. The wind moves here slow, thin currents that whisper through the dead grass and stir the fallen shingles that litter the ground. But something wasn't right, hikers. Say the silence is never complete, not at first. There's always a faint sound, just beneath the surface of the quiet, not the wind, not the shifting of trees, something deeper, hollow tone, distant, pulsing like a slow heartbeat through the soil, comes when no one is speaking, the moment their voices fall still, the moment their boots settle on the uneven ground. The tone begins at first. They say it feels like nothing more than a trick of the earth, a vibration running through the roots, the kind of resonance a body might mistake for its own pulse when standing too long in one place. But then, the air changes, the tone sharpens, faint but clear, carrying a pitch just high enough to hum in the teeth, to press faintly against the eardrums. It is not loud, it is not sudden, it just is, and once it starts, it doesn't stop the ground where they say it's strongest. Is not marked in no headstones, no remnants of the church, no sign of the quarry entrance that once swallowed the bell, only a hollow, concave stretch of earth, packed with gravel and dead leaves, where even the weeds grow sparsome. Who've stood there swear they can hear something beyond the tone, sound so faint it might not be there at all. Footsteps always the same pattern, slow, even measured, not approaching, not retreating, climbing, as though something or someone is ascending a stairwell just beneath the ground, each step soft, deliberate, landing in rhythm with the low, humming tone that rolls through the earth. The sound does not grow louder, it only continues until the tone shifts. The hikers who've stayed long enough to hear it say the shift is worse than the sound itself. The tone drops, hollow, empty, like a bell being struck underwater, the note spreading not through the air but through the bones, sinking into the chest and throat until breathing feels unnatural. No one speaks when it happens, not because they don't want to, because they can't. Air itself feels suspended. Every sound, even the smallest, seems to vanish. Boots scuffing on the dirt, wind slipping through branches, the faint rasp of a coat's fabric, all swallowed before they reach the ear. The only sound that remains is the toll, one long, deep note, so low it feels more imagined than heard, does not fade quickly. It lingers, rolling through the earth as though something below is holding the clapper, pulling the sound out until it feels stretched thin, ready to tear. Some claim the footsteps stop. When the note begins, others swear they don't. The steps grow closer, louder, no longer muffled, but echoing faintly in the soil beneath their feet, always in rhythm with the toll, always moving upward, but never arriving. Those who leave and speak about it after describe the silence afterward as worse than the sound itself. The toll stops. The ground falls still, and for a moment, the world feels hollow. The wind doesn't move, the branches don't sway. The earth itself feels brittle, as though one step too heavy might fracture the surface and open something that was never meant to be uncovered. Most leave quickly, some do not. There are stories of those who linger, people who wait, standing in the center of that concave ground. There, ears ringing with the fading hum, long after the tone itself has ended. Some kneel, pressing their palms to the dirt, listening others speak, softly, testing the air, breaking the rule they don't yet know exists, because once the voices start, the sound does not return out immediately. It waits until the last word fades, until the last breath falls silent, and then the tone begins again, low, hollow, patient. The footsteps follow each one, slow, deliberate rising, from somewhere far deeper than the quarry could ever reach. And though no one has seen what waits at the top of those steps, they all describe the same thing, the sound of the last toll cutting off. How finish it is, though whatever was climbing has finally stopped right beneath them. And in that silence, when the ground feels thinner than it should, when the air feels colder than the wind could ever make it, they swear they can feel it. Not a sound knot, a tremor, just the faint rhythmic sway of something enormous waiting for someone to speak. Oh, it can ring again. Some believe the bell never rang for the living, that it was forged not to summon prayer, but to call the dead to gather,